Welcome everyone who's joining. I see most of the waiting room has been admitted. Okay, let's get started. Welcome everybody to our Wildlife Economy debate series. My name is Leanne Kent, and I am a research assistant from the School of Wildlife Conservation at the African Leadership University. The focus of today's debate or discussion series is on creating an enabling environment for the wildlife economy in Africa. The purpose of the Wildlife Economy Debate Discussion Series is to facilitate an objective discussion and debate around various wildlife topics, to provide different perspectives that will contribute to our knowledge of the value of the wildlife economy here in Africa. And just some rules for today. Please remain on mute throughout the debate. Any questions and comments in the chat should be constructive and based on facts or science and not emotive. And then we are encouraging questions in the chat box, but if you are going to be asking a question, please use 3 question marks to distinguish it from a comment. Anyone disrupting the debate or discussion in any way will be removed. Please add your name and organization and where you are based in the chat. This also gives our speakers and the other participants in the room an idea of who is all participating today. The format for today, it is a 90-minute session. We'll start with the welcome and introduction and the first poll, which should be released on your screen, if you could all please answer that. We will then have the context setting where each participant will have 10 minutes each to just lay the foundations for the discussion today. We will then have a structured question and answer session with our moderator. And the audience will be given a chance to ask questions. So we'd encourage you to please send your questions through in the chat and give 3 question marks before a question. And then we'll have an additional poll at the end. Anyone who's attended our series will be aware of this before our moderator will close the session. Before I hand over, I would just like to say that this discussion series is part of a broader series focused on creating an enabling environment for the wildlife economy. Our moderator, Holly, will be introducing the first of these, and that the first is today's topic. But before I hand over to Holly, I'd like to thank everybody on the SOW team who is supporting today, particularly our director, Dr. Sue Snyman and Irene Mishlanga, who's on the call. I believe we also have other SOWC staff on the call, whom I unfortunately will not have the time to introduce. Also, a thank you to our speakers who have put in the time and effort to be here today. And then a final massive thank you to our moderator, Holly Dublin. And if any of you have attended our previous sessions, you will know her well. She's instrumental in not only moderating these sessions, but in the planning of these sessions. To you, Holly.
Thanks very much, Leanne, and good afternoon, good morning, good evening to all joining. Thanks very much for joining us today on our topic, Bridges to Building Wildlife Economies, the Conservation and Livelihood Impacts of Different Forms of Land Tenure. I want to welcome you to our discussion on these connections between land tenure and its impacts on wildlife conservation and local livelihoods. Just having a look at the polling results as they're coming in, I see that at least half of you feel that you have a pretty good basic understanding of land tenure and land rights. But my experience with it, and I spend quite a bit of time with it, is that when people like the speakers that we have today begin talking, we see that there is a great depth of knowledge. And sometimes I find conservationists talking about land rights and land tenure not dissimilar to when I find them talking about economics. You know, we're sort of good at it, but not perfect. So I think today is going to be a really great eye-opener for people. We're going to be today looking at various forms of land tenure, and specifically we're going to be focusing on statutory and community tenure and how these actually influence conservation and livelihood outcomes. And for that reason, we're going to be talking about our goal, which is to uncover both the benefits and the challenges to looking at strategies for building sustainable wildlife economies that benefit both biodiversity and local communities. Understanding well that land tenure and land rights sits right at the heart of many of the things that all of us are trying to work on. Now, I just want to say before I start going into these slides that in our next session, we're going to sort of go at a deeper depth, where we're going to explore the legal frameworks and opportunities for the devolution of user rights for both land and natural resources. And I think you're going to see how we're going to separate those out through today's talk. We're going to obviously be further clarifying how tenure and user rights actually can support wildlife economies and improve the well-being of communities. So I hope that people that are joining in today will come back and join us again, and invite others to join us for our next conversation, which is going to be more focused on user rights. So let me move to the slides a little bit now. So you're going to be hearing an awful lot from our first speaker on the issues of land tenure or property systems in land. And she's going to be talking to you about these three types: statutory tenure, religious tenure, and customary tenure, with a focus, as I said, on the statutory and customary. Next slide, please, Leanne. But I wanted people to just know a little bit before Liz starts getting into the real depths of this, which is to just put you in the picture of what we're talking about when these technical terms are used. So on the statutory tenure side, this would include state-owned protected areas, private protected areas, and individually owned land. That all falls under statutory tenure. And then there's customary tenure, which is community protection of the commons for livelihood and sociocultural purposes. And of course, we're talking about the limited expansion of settlement and farming into forest lands with special rules for the commons. So there are things that fall in between these two, but we're not going to go into those today. There's some complicated areas of the world and in Africa that have somehow come between those. And this is where you see a lot of problems, because they don't fit neatly into one or the other. And of course, laws are developed to support these different systems. Next, please, Leanne. So just to put people into a more comfortable zone where we actually are thinking about places that some of us know or all of us know, I thought it would just be useful to give you some examples so that you can have those in your mind. It may not be clear to you at this point in time why one falls in one place or one falls in another, but that should become more obvious as we hear from our speakers. So for example, in Botswana, the Okavango Delta is managed under statutory tenure as a Ramsar site. In South Africa, the Sabi Sand Game Reserve is an adjacent area to Kruger National Park, but of course it is a collection of private game reserves. Those also coming into this statutory category. Then in Tanzania, a very common example, which would be in many countries, would be the Serengeti National Park, which is managed there under the parastatal Tanzania National Parks, TANAPA. And in Kenya, and I think this one is more of a surprise for people, the majority of conservancies in the Masai Mara area under the MMWCA, which we've heard from them before, are comprised of individual privately owned title deeds. So these are all landowners that have actually been given deed and have come back together and brought that land back together again. So many people have thought of that as being more similar to customary, but it's important to see these examples so that you know when you're thinking about these places that actually legally they fall in different categories. So next one, please, Leanne. So when we come into customary tenure, we would be thinking about places like the Chimanimani National Reserve in Mozambique, where you have a protected area that's co-managed by communities, along with the Mozambican government, ANAC, and conservation organization like WWF. So it's got a lot of players going on, but it is under customary tenure. In Namibia, the community conservancies that, of course, are very well known to our audience here, as one of the most successful examples of customary tenure and what it can deliver in terms of conservation. In Tanzania, and we're going to be hearing a lot about this, thankfully, today from our other speaker on the wildlife management areas. Many people think of those as not as being under state ownership, but in fact, they are managed by local communities. as well as having another 2 to 5 million hectares of land managed under village land forest reserves. So there's huge pieces of land, and that's a big part of our story here today, that under customary tenure, we have some pretty exciting opportunities. In the Democratic Republic of Congo, there's 300 million hectares of natural forests, many of them home to wildlife, that have been issued as forest concessions to up to 250 communities in perpetuity. And these communities follow along with certain conservation rules that are established. So next, Leanne, I want to now move into giving you a kind of a view of how things sit in Africa. So this is just a breakdown of these different land forms. And you can see that we've broken them down here into urban land, rural infrastructure land, agricultural land, protected areas, and community lands. Thanks very much to our speaker, Liz Alden-Wiley, for helping put this together. And then the next one, Leanne, showing you that the wildlife domain is absolutely massive here in this land distribution. So in terms of protected areas, over 14%, but in terms of community lands, the light green, we're talking about an area of over 60% in Africa. So it really is an amazing natural heritage, a tremendous asset that Africa has, and tremendous opportunities to build these biodiversity and wildlife economies. So I'm going to come on now to our speakers today. And we're very, very, very fortunate to have with us two friends and colleagues who have for a long time been working in these areas. And I think many of you will know them, but perhaps know one maybe more than another just from this series. So Dr. Liz Alden-Wiley is a scholar and practitioner with over 40 years of experience in Africa and Asia. She's specialized in the legal recognition of community-based property systems, such as customary tenure. But as you're going to see, Liz knows a whole lot more than that about land tenure, and she's going to be sharing tremendous insight with us to help us in this discussion. Many of you, of course, will know Sam Shaba. Sam's recently changed his position, but he joined Honey Guide as a GIS and M&E officer 10 years ago now, I guess, in 2014, and eventually now has become the CEO. So Sam's one of our great success stories of Africa. So where he now is leading the organization's strategic vision, stakeholder engagement, and quite honestly, Sam is doing such a great job on so many of these amazing webinars on different topics, but we're super glad to have both of them here today. So I'm now going to start in the session. We're going to do this a little bit differently for those of you that have been with us for some time. We're actually going to be dividing this into two 10-minute presentations. I usually hold people to just these very short intros, but we have some complex things to cover today. And before doing that, I guess it's up to me to share these results, I've just realized, so that everyone can see. Leanne, is that possible for people to see those results as I share them
on my screen?
I don't know if everyone can see them, but I can just tell you that 8% had no understanding, 54% have a basic understanding, 35% a moderate understanding, and 4% a good understanding. So we have a span there, but Liz, there's lots of teaching yet to do. So over to you, Liz, and I think let us know when you want those couple of slides that we've prepared for you. Over to you, Liz.
Okay, thanks, Holly. You could actually, well, hang on, no, wait. Don't put the two slides up yet. Hi, everyone, and Holly and Leanne, my apologies for unavoidable slight delay, but I'm here now. And also, Holly, I know you'll keep a tight rein on time with me. It's great to be here. And just in this 10 minutes, I only have time to talk about two things. One is to give you a bit more information on the relations between statutory religious and particularly customary tenure, so important to us in Africa. And then two, to give you a bit of information on the massive tenure reform, property reform. Tenure and property are really, when it comes to land, we can use interchangeably. So the first thing, and no slides needed here, Holly, for the moment, just a couple of bits of information. First, people often ask about religious tenure, but remember that we're talking about all Africa, and I'm going to give you an Africa-wide view. And so we have no fewer than, let me see, we have about 40+% of Africans are actually Muslim. And by my statistics, 43 states provide Sharia courts, most important for family law, divorce, inheritance, and particularly women's rights. Sharia, Islam is the only religion that actually has a very detailed land codes, property codes. There's a couple of chapters in the Quran itself, but also in the many, many volumes of legal interpretation in the first 5 centuries, which followed until today. For us, talking about wildlife, which falls into the category of communal lands or commons, it's quite important in the 15 countries which, mainly North and Sahelian Africa, which practice predominantly Islam, because there is a very big standing and ancient rule, which ensures that every village has mawat. And in Central Asia, where I've worked quite a bit, mawat really remains the dominant kind of land. And mawat, its legal treatment relates more, however, to received law, European law, which is now we call statutory law, where even though those lands are made available, according to Sharia, they're not supposed to be owned or ownable. But in actual practice, like if I can make a second point, all these 3 systems, customary tenure, statutory tenure, religious tenure, have all changed a lot with each couple of decades, and particularly customary with each generation. And that both under statutory tenure, as you will see, but particularly even under religious law, mawat is now more legally ownable. But that's quite important for us when you consider that most of the commons are actually in the Sahel and North Africa. And the Tuareg, for example, the largest indigenous people in Africa by number, 30 million people, it's absolutely critical for them. But a second thing really important to remember is all 8 billion people today live within a state. And the main function of the state is to produce laws. State law or statutory law always comes first. So for us as practitioners, it's always really important to see how does the state law treat religious law. That's in the Sahel. In the rest of Africa, how does the state law treat customary law? So a good part of my work, for example, is examining what do modern laws say about customary land tenure. And this, customary law, I don't think I need to tell you, differs so strongly from state law, which is controlled at the state level, developed by state laws. Customary law is community-based law, which is one of its great strengths. And it only exists for as long as the majority of the members of the community agree with the rules and adhere to the rules. So that is one of its greatest strengths, that it is beneficiary driven in terms of the law. By law, strictly speaking, it's unwritten law, and we can call them customary rules. Right. So as I say, they're all hybrids today. Just another interesting fact of you all, actually, in terms when it comes to the kind of rights that each of these systems deliver in practice, by far and away, customary land rights outnumber this by very, very much more. It's often not realized that most, for example, most private titles are found in cities and towns. And also bear in mind that cities and towns take very little land, surprisingly, even though today in Africa, for example, they house 46% of Africa's population. They still take a tiny area of land. So all this other land, you can say in effect, is rural land. So you can see where the scope for communities and community land law and community-based land law is very important. Secondly, it's really important to know, okay, that it's very late in the day, one could say hundreds of years late, and particularly so that many liberated colonial states have taken a long time to reach this, but there is a massive property rights reform going on, and it's global. 73 of 100 states, 73%, have changed in their national laws what the status of customary land rights are. Some of them quite dramatically. And this, by the way, since 1990, it began in Africa really in the 1990s, the last continent to really get a grip on this. But we're talking about let me look at some of my facts and figures here. We're talking about at least 36 of 55 African states have made big changes. Very uneven, some are much more progressive. And if, I can give you an idea. For me, the top 10 are, in terms of what their laws say about customary tenure, Mozambique, Uganda, Tanzania, Kenya, Burkina Faso, Benin, Togo, South Sudan, in name only and law only, zero implementation really, Sierra Leone and Liberia. But there's a number of countries, among them Ethiopia, Chad, and DRC, who all have very exciting new land laws on the books that should be enacted by the end of the year.
Liz, I just want to give you your 1-minute warning.
Right, so thank you, Holly. So, and then there are a lot of other countries who, and there's at least in my research, I list about 18 who have made big changes, but they have a major flaw or major gap. And unfortunately, again, for us, I find the major gap is in their handling, not of individual or even family customary rights, which largely affect houses and farms. They're pretty weak when it comes to the major resource of communities, which is their communal lands, their commons, their rangelands, their forests, their woodlands, their grasslands, their swamplands, very, very important, which are really crucial to their livelihood, their identity, and their way of life. Just to find
Liz,
okay.
You're out of time, but if you wanted to show those two maps of yours, we can, or we can just...
Okay, just a couple of, if you can just, okay, now it's a bit out of date. It's from Landmark, which I helped set up with 4 other people. World Rights Institute is a key actor and holds all the data. This map, new maps are going to be launched at Climate Week in September, but this map just gives you an idea of the immensity of even so far the mapped community lands. They're massive. Look at Australia, look at Latin America, look at Mexico, almost entirely community lands. The gaps that you see in Africa are more for the lack of our mapping, and the maps in September that will be launched will show much more for the Sahel. And the key instrument for all of this are community land titles called different lands, village lands or customary lands, or all sorts of names, cooperatives. But if we can go to the next slide, Holly. Okay, this is one example of a country which is among the top 10 in terms of actually getting down to the hard work of identifying, mapping, adjudicating, and registering community lands. The different colors mean they're at a different stage. They have done, these are 250, nearly 2,500 plus communities there, and another 500 or so to go. So that gives you an example, but keep in mind that the legal construct of community land title it's for customary rights, but it's embedded in constitutions and land laws. So this is where you see the marriage of statutory and customary law. And again, if I can repeat that point, we always have to look first, what does the national law, the federal law, the state law say about community land rights? Thank you, Holly.
Thanks very much, Liz. Great. I'm going to move right on to Sam. And Leanne, if you could bring up that first slide for Sam, because I think he's going to move from map to map as his opening. Over to you, Sam.
Hi, Holly. Thank you very much. Okay, so I will focus on Tanzania. And thank you, Liz, for giving that African context of different land tenure forms for conservation. And in Tanzania, I will tell you that the national parks are the most protected wildlife areas in Tanzania. The first one was Serengeti. Most of us know about Serengeti. It was started about 70 years ago in 1950s. And when national parks were formed, then usually people were moved out of the national parks to allow for wildlife conservation to happen. Now, today, over a third of our country in Tanzania is protected in some way. Majority of those are national parks. We have 21 of those. However, we also have other forms that are less restrictive, like game reserves, game controlled areas. We have the forest reserves and several others. However, majority of wildlife in Tanzania does not stay in national parks. In fact, over 60% of wildlife roams outside national parks into community areas where people live and farm. And you should realize that the government realized this over 2 decades ago. The government, learning from Namibia and Botswana, they came and established a model to allow for wildlife conservation outside state-owned or state-run national parks. In Tanzania, we call these wildlife management areas. In other countries, such as Kenya, our neighbors, in Botswana and Namibia, they will call them conservancies. Now, you should realize that this is not the only form of communal conservation happening in Tanzania. We have other forms. Majority of the land is in this form of wildlife management areas, but we have other forms like village forest reserves that Holly spoke about. We have customary rights of occupancy, we call them CCROs, that allows for a community to come together to register a piece of land and to own it together and allow conservation to happen in that land. Now, the survival of our wildlife in Tanzania, and it's the case in most other countries, depends on being able to use these communal lands. Our national parks are not fenced. We're talking about close to 400 square kilometers total protected area. It is impossible to fence them. Wildlife moves in and out every time. They use these areas as corridors, as dispersal areas, as buffer zones, as breeding grounds to move from one national park to the other. Without these areas, wildlife would not survive in Tanzania, period. Now, when the government formed these community-owned wildlife management areas, buffering our national parks, and you can see from that map, all the red ones, they realized that this will allow for wildlife conservation to happen outside state-run national parks, but also to bring value to people who allow this wildlife to roam in their backyard. So they are important. Our national parks are making millions. Our national parks are important to our country, but the community areas enable for the national parks to exist. The national parks are too hard to expand and they are expensive to run. Now, the people in this example that I'll talk about, 38 areas, most of these areas do not benefit people's livelihoods. It was a move for the government, the big conservation practitioners, to form these areas with a promise that they will benefit people and people will want to conserve. But that has not really happened in most of these places. I can count in one hand the ones that have made significant amount of money. They are not many. And I hope to talk more about that today. Because for conservation to happen in these places, it has to make meaningful value to the people, both economically and non-monetary values. We have some examples of success. We have places where having this model allowed people to secure their land rights. For the first time, to own a title deed for the land and not being worried about that land being grabbed by rich people or outsiders. We have examples of people of areas where having these community wildlife management areas allowed for traditional livelihood activities to continue, such as securing land to graze livestock for pastoralist communities. Those are success stories. We have examples of places where these areas have made money from tourism, carbon, and that money has been used to deliver value to people for community development projects. Unfortunately, we also have many, many examples of failure, examples of struggle, examples of challenges, examples of places where there hasn't been any viable business models that has really worked. When you look at this map, most of the southern Tanzania red areas are struggling to attract business. So they are not making money, they are not operating. It's not easy to undo a wildlife management area once it's done. So they suffer agreeing to registering them. We have examples, and this is increasing, a challenge of human-wildlife conflicts. The more people allow for wildlife to come closer to their settlements and where they farm, the easier it is for wildlife to get into those areas and destroy. It is even worse when you have the big ones like the elephants and the lions attacking people's crops, attacking people's livelihoods. And it's not easy to deal with them. You don't just scare them away. In Tanzania, the work that we do at Honey Guide is to look at these areas and figure out what really works. What would be the incentive to convince these people to allow conservation to happen? Because we, the international community, the government, and even other Tanzanians who were born and raised away from these places, we want wildlife to continue exist in these lands. And for that, we have to make it meaningful for the people who own this land, because otherwise, people are thinking of figuring out other alternative uses of that land. That land is being encroached with agriculture where it's possible, where it's the alternative that matters to them. Unmanaged grazing is happening in most of these southern Tanzania ones. People will allow, for example, poaching to happen, even if the poachers are not their own. They just allow it because it doesn't matter to them. They can take the land back, and why care? So I hope today we'll talk more about how do we make this work, what are some successes and some challenges that we have seen, at least in the Tanzanian context, in wildlife management areas and in other forms that secured local communities access to land and security for their land tenure. Thank you very much, Holly.
Thanks, Sam. Excellent. Thank you very much. So Liz and Sam, please stay on with me, because we're now going to move into some questions and answers from you two, which give you a little chance to go into more depth. I did just want to say for our audience, you can see that what we're trying to do here is to span a very vast amount, right? We're getting from understanding really the structure of land tenure and how it functions, and then going to the other extreme with Sam of, okay, then when you have that, what kinds of things can happen in terms of both opportunities and challenges. So I want to go back, Liz, excuse me, to you just for a moment, because we hear a lot of things in the conservation community, or those of us that just even read the news. Can you explain to us why some governments actually claim to own all the land? And a lot of times communities find themselves having to address that issue with some people feeling that the government says they own everything. And maybe just as a follow-on to that, you might want to give us your views on what you see the attitude of government to be about these community lands. Thanks. Over to you, Liz. Got to unmute yourself.
Sorry. Okay.
No problem.
Hi. Thank you.
Right.
Your question about governments. Okay. Governments on the whole, yeah, as I said, it's a global movement. And just to be clear, the reason it's a global movement is because of a surprising fact. Only 12 of 196 modern states were not colonized. That means only 12 did not directly receive the laws, civil law from Europe or common law from Britain, and their norms, which were, when it came to colonization, purposely manipulated to maximize the new colonial administrators' ownership of land. And that included denial of, not only denial that, for example, Africa was already owned, but denial also in particular that the area of most concern to us, the rangelands, forest lands, swamplands, they called them wastelands or herrenlos or boldios or terres sans maître, wastelands that only the state could own. And that's why we have, for example, this long heritage of the state is always, so far, but hopefully it won't be for long, the only owner of national game reserves and national parks and national reserves. Their attitude of governments to community lands is recognition that this decolonization is absolutely essential. They can't go on pretending that community-based property systems, customary law, does not deliver perfectly viable rights in land, and do so until the present. So to an extent, the will is there, but governments hate to let go. They've had a century in Africa, 5.5 centuries in Latin America of owning and controlling those lands for all intents and purposes. They hate to let go. And the values of those lands are so high. We see endless, what we call rent seeking, wanting to capture all the values of those lands. Waters. It's only in the last 25 years that all waters in Africa have been nationalized. It is with 3 very important country exceptions. It is only minerals, subterranean minerals, more understandably, are nationalized. But the grasp of the state has been very pervasive. Wildlife is usually understandably, perhaps also understandably, a national resource. in most countries, but they don't like to surrender that. We are also seeing where, I think rent seeking is the major problem. I think simply implementing the law is a major problem. It takes a lot of time to identify and map and adjudicate and register even a community land, let alone all the what we call derivative rights, the rights of families to their particular parcel, exclusive right of occupancy, inheritable, for example. We see that. So there are many reasons. They also, it takes time for officialdom and politicians, often to their own convenience, to move beyond the idea that the only security is an individual land title, because that's what has been embedded, so heavily embedded in national law, and that a community can be an owner, a family can be owner. And while they acknowledge all that, they have difficulty, and they certainly do not financially invest to the level they should. Secondly, I'll leave it there. What was your second question?
No, that's good, because I'm going to let you, while I go to Sam, I'm going to let you, Liz, think about some examples where you've seen, successes of, shall we say, the government being more yielding and actually moving things, and maybe actually a couple of examples where things have not been going so well. And I'm going to go to Sam now. And Sam, because you're helping us to think about some places where there's real things going on, and we've seen the successes, we've seen the failures, what are the key factors to consider for ensuring that long-term sustainability for wildlife economies in these community-owned lands? What do you think is really sitting at the bottom? You shared with us a bit about, hey, there's a lot of places where there isn't just a good business case and there aren't good business models, but if you had to say, what would be a few of those key factors?
Yeah, okay. So I usually think of the sustainability in three major factors, and this is what guides our work even here in Tanzania. The first one we have to think about, most of us conservation practitioners, you start by thinking of wildlife, protect, protect, protect. We usually turn it around and think about the business side of it. Can it become financially sustainable? It is very expensive to manage these areas. In most conservation areas, majority of the money goes to protection. Over 60% of the operational expenses in protection. Now, if you ask people to conserve, you're also asking them to take the burden of paying for the operational expenses. It has to make money, or the government or somebody needs to pay them at least to manage that land as a protected area. The second thing is the social value, and we've said it. People have to find value in accepting wildlife in their land. Otherwise, if that value is not cultivated somehow, they will figure out alternative use of that land. Now, when I talk about value, please don't just think about monetary values. Later, we can explore, and I've seen a question in the chat that I would like to answer later. What other ways we can make it valuable to people's livelihood? We have to be creative with this one. And the third thing is the ecological integrity. Most of these places were started just because a conservation practitioner, an NGO, felt they needed it to work. There are some of these areas that have very low conservation value. And we have to be honest with ourselves. For those that cannot make money, they are not adding much to our conservation. We should be happy to let go. And that's something that our government should not accept easily.
I think that's a great point, Sam, is can we be bold enough to say when something doesn't have the potential, and we don't think even with massive amounts for restoration, it's moved on to another state. So that's really great. I'm going to circle back around to you just now to follow up on some of this, just to let our audience know that we're capturing all of your questions. If you have questions, please put them directly into the chat, and we're going to come back to those because there's an opportunity for us later on to to be asking all of you. So I'm moving back and forth in my vertical way between Liz and Sam. So Liz, I'm going to come back to you and ask you about some of those situations where we've seen, Sam's obviously giving us some great examples from Tanzania, but are there other places where we've seen kind of, you know, pretty good success at the government really pitching in there and helping to get this recognition, giving communities more opportunity anywhere they're giving them financial support, and any that really stick out to you as these are problem areas that are going the wrong direction? And just a couple minutes, Liz, we're trying to keep these into short answers, and then we're going to open up with the rest of the audience. Thanks.
Okay, thanks, Holly. Just randomly then, South Africa stands out in one particular way, that it moved faster, has moved faster than anyone, not only with recognition, obviously, that existing rights should be registered, able to be registrable as lawful property rights, but it then launched into restitution. A troublesome process, but the only point I'd make here, at least 60 of the successful land claims have actually been for existing protected areas. Now, there are problems with most of the models for what then happens to the community-owned protected area, and I don't have time to go into that. But that restitution thrust, all over Africa, we have 10 countries right now that have court cases against governments for particularly hunter-gatherers. We're talking DRC, Uganda, Kenya, Liberia are very prime examples, saying, no, we must be able to have these lands restored to us as community lands subject to very rigorous conservation conditions. And this is where many governments, Kenya government is paramount at the moment on this, is refusing, is a good case. It just can't bear the thought of doing that because it still has very outdated ideas of who, you know, how conservation can happen and who should be conservators. Liberia is a good example in a couple of respects. Again, I'm going to limit my comments just to the conservation sector. It says in black and white in the law in 2018, not a single more protected area, state protected area can be created without the free, prior, informed consent of a community. And in fact, to be fair to Tanzania, the Forest Act is unique on the continent of saying you cannot create a new national forest reserve, which are called catchment forests, in Tanzania, unless an autonomous committee has shown that there is no community able to do that, to turn them into village land forest reserves. Other successes, I would name Algeria. 44% of Algeria's land is held into absolutely vast cultural parks. And within those parks, millions of Tuareg have complete rights. That's a good example. There are a lot of bad examples where laws have been flawed, but that might give you a flavor. And of course, I mentioned DRC earlier.
Yeah, that's great, Liz. You know, we have to celebrate the successes and grieve all the things that don't work. But I think we do see movement. And I think that one of the things that's really happening is just a building awareness, which is why we're holding things like this and why there's many discussions going on with governments, because for a very long time, none of this was brought to the fore. And I think that one of the things we do see, and I know many of us are working on, is the building of community voice. But I wanted to go back to you, Sam, to share with me, how do you think we can balance the interests of conservation with the needs of local communities in these areas? I mean, it's all great, you know, when communities are doing things that the conservationists think is all wonderful, it's all going in a good direction, but it isn't so all great for conservationists when they think things are going in a bad way, and things are being lost. But we have to be so cognizant of our communities, right? Because they're the ones that are accruing all the cost of living with wildlife in these areas. So how do you think we can work on balancing those, and give us some of your insights?
Thanks, Holly. I was just responding to Moses's question in the chat, and I think it's kind of related. So how do we balance? And I won't be as exhaustive here because I don't know everything about it, but with some examples of how we've been able to do that in Tanzania in some small scale. We go into these areas with a very serious goal about economic incentives to people. And when I say economic incentives, I do not just mean monetary ones, because some of these areas don't make as much as the national parks. They're not the prime wildlife areas, but they're important to the prime wildlife areas. So when we view at benefits for communities, just in monetary terms, some of them will not be rich enough to make that much. So let's just go with the idea that people have to make a good living from their land. Otherwise, they will not want it to be conservation. So if conservation provides jobs, it happens, that's good. If it brings revenues from tourism, from carbon, that's better. If it offers meaningful addition to their livelihoods, it's even better. And for you've asked about pastoralist communities, for example. For them, we've seen it in northern Tanzania, the Maasai communities in Tanzania, even being able to access grass in these so-called protected wildlife areas means a lot. For us, it's been a winner. Like, you allow that in a communal area, they care about our livelihoods, and they're on board. They want to conserve. They're like, okay, we can balance. We know how to manage grazing. They've done it for years. That's why they have wildlife, and other communities don't in other countries. So they know how to balance how their livestock grazing can not impact the conservation in their land. So those are some ideas. I can talk more, but those have been our winners in areas that have been successful.
Thanks, Sam. I think there's going to be some opportunities, because I see a number of the questions are sort of coming in on this from our audience that we're going to come back to. So Liz, back over to you again. We can see that from the previous things you were saying to us, that community-based tenure, customary tenure, has been under quite a lot of challenges on a very large scale across a lot of countries. So how has it survived? And what have been the things that have kept the embers burning that we now are able to fan and help them to grow?
That's a very important question. And I can say, again, this is an Africa-wide, but also a global answer that pretty well applies everywhere. Number one, it is simply because it is a highly localized community-based system that is directly relevant to the real lives, real culture, real identity, the real territory of a particular community. So the rules, as I mentioned earlier, are very adaptable. You know, neo-customary would be a more correct term for customary tenure. And it's very adaptable and very easily adaptable. And the administration is right there. You don't have to go to the Ministry of Lands to find out if your exclusive right to the community's land for a house or for a farm is being respected. You're right there in the community. But and so the actual administration of it is extremely cheap and localized and effective. And rights are geared to the reality. So it's very realistic. Family tenure dominant, either family tenure or communal tenure, where the community owns all the off-farm resources and manages them. That is very commonsensical. So the system makes sense. But most of all, the key driver to its continuation globally, including in Africa, including in all the countries that all our participants come from, is simply the commons. That the major, by area, the major asset, even for settled farming communities, of great value are the rangelands, grasslands, forestlands, woodlands, swamplands. Absolutely a critical part. And as long as those exist, and which exist over more than 50% of the global land area, so 6 billion hectares, that will always be important. Governments, one of the incentives for governments, by the way, in which helps keep legal recognition or prompts legal recognition of community-based tenure systems, is that, at least in words, it's what they claim to seek, fully inclusive and devolved governance. Well, you get that with customary tenure. Full of flaws, chief capture, big issue in Zambia, Malawi, Ghana, all sorts of issues. It's imperfect, but it is a vibrant living system. Thank you.
I think that's fantastic, Liz. And I know many of us want to see that vibrancy and want to see it grow, because we're seeing successes in places, even though we're aware of the challenges. Now, I'm going to come on to you, Sam, for a last question, but yeah, why don't I just move to that? I'm going to maybe even surprise you a bit, because I want to move you to another space. So with all this, and we got a lot of questions for you that we're going to come to from the audience, but like what gets Sam up in the morning with his tail wagging and thinking, I'm ready for today? I know Sam pretty well, so I know he gets up and thinks things like that, and he's always energetic. But what's going on in your mind, Sam? Where are those areas of such great hope for you?
Sam, you're muted. And Holly, you're also muted.
Sam, you're muted.
I also have that disease of speaking on muted Zoom session. So I like technology. I got into conservation with a technology hat. I started with GIS and mapping. I like a challenge. Like, I saw how we can apply tech in improving conservation, but I also see a lot more challenges that technology has brought to conservation. In community conservation, and it's something I just got into by accident joining Honeyguide. I really like it when we make meaningful impact to the people. I'm currently joining this call from one of the places we work with, Macau WMA, outside Serengeti National Park. I had a session today speaking with those people. They are just normal people like my parents. And they have given up a big chunk of land to protect Macau. And today we were chatting to them to say, how much money do you make? They said a figure, and I said, how much money do you spend? They said another figure, which is even bigger. I like a challenge, and I will really feel good when in a few years we figure out ways to double the money they make and also to contain the operational expenses so that they are injecting a lot more in their lives, in their livelihoods. And that gets me up at night. When I can't figure that out, I'm really sad, because I'm thinking of them and saying, why would they care? Like, I wouldn't care if I lived here. Why would they? So a good challenge like that wakes me up.
That's great. And Liz, I'm going to come back to you just for one last quick one before we go to our audience questions. So based on, your research and your many years of experience, what policy recommendations would you make to support these sustainable land tenure systems, whether it's statutory, whether it's customary, for wildlife conservation and local livelihood benefits? Where is the real work needed ahead?
Well, number one, it's going to be hard for communities to control and benefit from livelihood, as Sam has implied. We take for granted this in Tanzania because it's happening, but globally, without having secure tenure. And I do think that really is happening, but needs a great deal more investment in what we can call community-based conservation, based on lands that they already hold, and lands that many, as I say, a good 25 countries out of 55 in Africa already have the right to, but we need to mobilize that, we call it double locking, that entitlement process, that they actually hold in their hand their community land titles, however they're structured country to country, and there are differences. I think there's a little bit in the conservation sector, perhaps overselling one model in favor of another. And I did a recent review of 36 cases of community-based conservation in Africa last year. And to be honest, things don't last. They have to be constantly renewed. The vulnerability of even communities and community members to, let me be frank, to corruption, to breaking the rules. And there are also big mistakes that are made. In Tanzania, the biggest mistake was encouraging, and it took some time to do, in the community forest sector, village land forest reserves, investing in saying, oh, you must be able to harvest your forest. These are slow-growing miombo and miombo-like forests. You don't harvest them. You use only the deadlock. We need to learn to be a lot more open to piloting, to critiquing what exists, and testing and developing more models, learning from others. There is a lot of stuff that's happening that is not getting out there. And also, I think, we definitely have reached the point. And if we remember it didn't quite say it, the Convention of Biodiversity Development Framework in December 2022, but it did point out, in effect, that governments, not all protected areas have to be owned by government. So again, in fact, they're looking for what they're calling other OECMs, but 30 by 30 isn't, I think, it really communities, and bearing in mind, we're talking there are 300,000 minimum communities across Africa, a minimum of 750 million people. They have to come out loud and clear, whoa, stop. Don't turn our lands into more protected areas. Invest in us to set up our own community wildlife areas, such as Sam has described. Invest in us to set up our own forest reserves, our own swampland reserves, very important. So those are some possible lessons.
That's great, Liz, and thanks for bringing up the 600-pound gorilla of the 30 by 30 target, which probably most of us have in our day-to-day lives, but it's on the minds of many governments. Maybe not Tanzania, maybe not Zambia, because they're already sitting on these large areas that they can, already say, well, these qualify. But most countries in Africa are nowhere near 30%, and they know they're going to need their communities. So I'm going to draw that part to an end. I gave a little 5 minutes extra just because I thought our speakers have done a great job, and I've been following the questions, and I know that some of them have been already touched on. So we have just another little bit of sort of like 15 minutes left. And I've captured, I think we have the questions that came out of the audience. And I'm going to do it by just giving you guys the questions as they came, rather than opening up the mic, just so that we can get as many of them as possible in, because you know that once people take the floor, they tend to take more than the time to ask the question. So Sam, if you think there's just anything to add to these, if you think you've said enough, that's fine. Most of these questions are for you. Moses, asked you, in your view, Sam, what needs to be done to ensure the communities play a meaningful role in the conservation of these areas? And then I think we'll take those and then move on to other ones. Maybe the one from Simon Sapuki, also, in your view, Sam, what do conservancies need to do for the community to appreciate conservation efforts and join the movement without feeling they have been sidelined? So maybe just taking on a couple of those together, if you wouldn't mind.
Yeah, thanks, Holly. And I've responded in the chat, but I'll say another thing that I haven't said there is, and this is true mostly for communal areas and not the private owned or the state owned. I cannot say enough how important good governance is. Had it been a private land, well, if it's your family land or your own land, you don't really need a board or governance to make decisions, okay? If it's state run, it's too complicated for any governance structures there. But communally owned resource, and we've seen this from all the writings about the commons, you need good governance there. How are the decisions made? Are they inclusive enough? Are they transparent? Are the benefits of that only ending in a few? And you would see in most of these conservation areas in Africa, those decisions are done by a third party. It's an NGO or the government trying to re-centralize, like this Liz put it. It's not the community who own the resource. That is when they feel sidelined. It's like who decided that the percentage, the certain percent should go back to whoever, to government or to whoever? Who decides how they use their money? Who decide which investor they accept and who they say bugger off to? So all those things are really important if you want them to not feel sidelined, if you want them to feel like they own the challenge, they own the problem, and they will own the successes and the failures and the things along it.
Great. I'm going to come back to a couple other ones for you, Sam, but I wanted to, Liz, make you just aware of a comment from Philip Samura. I can't agree with you more, Liz, on the role of colonialism in land management and the need for decolonization in practice. How do you envision the decolonization process considering three dimensions of coloniality: knowledge, power, and being? I mean, you've touched a lot, Liz, on kind of how these things are being overcome and how they're being, in many countries, turned around. But if you'd like to add some comments on that, I'm sure Philip would be grateful.
Thank you. Thank you, Philip. You know, on the good side, the decolonization of property relations, as we can call it, it's gone far enough where it's actually the cat is out of the bag or the genie's out of the box. You can't turn it back. And that's one of the things that, for example, resistant governments are most annoyed about. They almost have no choice now, given both the enormous precedents set in international law, being set globally, country after country. Don't forget, over 50% of Canada is community land owned by Inuits and First Nations. 40+% of Australia is the same. New Zealand, all of Oceania, all the 11 islands are basically community land. Asia, even, I just want to make clear, and it'll come up, by the way, in the landmark new maps, Europe, 17% of Portugal, they now realize are community-owned forests, 17% of the whole land area. And it's even higher in Romania and some Eastern European states. In terms of in Africa, how do we move forward? Empowerment, 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 mobilization, 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 and just pursuing. I've been positive. I've said we've got actually some thousands of communities already have community land titles in one form or another. That needs to be pushed. Governments And the Francophone governments, I have to say, are the worst at this. They pass laws, then take 2, 3, 4, 5, 10 years, some of them, like Gabon, like Republic of Congo, 10 years, or like DRC, 30 years to actually deliver on the legal promise, regulations, decrees, etc. These things, so it's push, push, push. It also, speaking truth to power is always difficult. I live in Kenya, and you know, we have seen the enormous power fuse. And remember, the median age today of African citizens throughout the continent, throughout all 55 states, is 19. So I sometimes feel we just ignore that tremendous youth capacity, and that's something I think, you know, is a vacuum. Gender rights are very important, if only for the fact that they're 50% of the population, but more significantly is, I've seen it time and time and again, a project is set up by men. Men are the major actors. They get bored after 5 years. Who takes over? The women. No, I don't mean that with any
Not that you're opinionated on that, right, Liz?
Not that I'm opinionated on that. Okay.
Okay, well, I'm gonna just turn back to Sam on one thing, and then I'm gonna end this session on another note. Sam, I know that in the chat you answered Mutale's question about the wildlife management areas and the planning. So I'm gonna leave that one at that because I think you covered it. I'm gonna ask if you could give just some very brief comment on Alex Lekishon's question. How do we ensure that communities that are protecting wildlife get sufficient benefits accrued to conservation? We have the issues of carbon credits, biodiversity credits, the tourism sector, but many times the communities aren't benefiting from these. And these are areas that I work quite a bit in, and I know you could spend many hours on them, but I don't know, Sam, if you could give us just some few comments. I know you did answer Alex in the chat, but others might not have seen it. So feel free to give us a brief answer on that before I move to our last point. Thanks, Sam.
Yeah, okay. So unfortunately, I don't have the answer to that, but I'll just side with Alex here saying most communal benefits, like in communally owned protected areas, most of the benefits, they come communal. So you get money from tourism or from carbon, and that money goes and builds a school or a hospital. However, in a neighboring village that doesn't have a protected area or a wildlife management area, they also get a school from government. So those brings failings, and it is a policy issue, so to speak. It is still a challenge that we haven't figured. In some very small cases, we've figured ways to make the benefits individual. You want to try as much as possible, make that benefit reach the household or the person, then it matters more. When those benefits are communal, it is complicated. Some money gets eaten by the elites or the village leaders. Some benefits, they are diluted because they are government ones. So we just have to be creative, and we haven't figured that one out yet. We don't want to individualize land. We don't want subdivisions. We don't want to fragment the ecosystem. We prefer communal, but communal benefits are hard to manage. And that's just the sad fact.
Yep. So while we've seen some of the positive, we know that there's a lot of challenges. And that is going to bring me on to a last point, which, Sam, I know you wanted to make a comment on, but let me just come to this first, because Vimbai has brought this issue up. Many of you on here will note that we haven't spent a lot of time talking about these individually owned private properties. And that's for a very specific reason, because we had another speaker who was going to talk just directly on that. And he got tied up in something more important than this, for sure. So just to say, I'm going to read out Vimbai's question, Sam, to you. I know you wanted to make some comments, but just before giving that over to you, Sam, and you might be wanting to touch on the same thing. I don't know, Vimbai, when you joined, but at the beginning, I did mention that in the Masai Mara conservancies is that most people don't realize that the very big majority of those conservancies are actually privately owned lands. And I know you bring up the racial issue, I'm going to come out with that. But in this case, those are all subdivided properties that are owned by Kenyan landlords, Black Kenyan landlords, who are largely pastoralists. They're largely Maasai from that area. Yes, there's some properties that are not, but that now is land where the benefits are going directly back to communities. The issue is that privatization has its upside and its downside, and some countries are not moving to that privatization. They're instead moving to community title. In Kenya, we have the Community Lands Act. There are many arguments in both directions, but I think your point is very good, and I'm just going to give that over to you, Sam. How do we make conservation inclusive when most areas are privately owned, and in some instances, and apologies for mentioning race, but mostly owned by whites, yet the communities are the Black majority? It's a sensitive topic most times to them, as they feel they are just pawns. So I know, Sam, you wanted to comment on this, so I'm going to give you that last comment on this, please. Thanks.
Holly, the trouble is you've answered it much better than me, and you've used the Masai Mara example, so it make it hard to me. But I'll just talk about maybe the South African example. There's very little that I know about it. One thing to mention is it's just sad, but land grabbing is real. It is possible, when that land is not bringing meaningful value to people, for them to sell it out to people who think can make better use of the land. And that happens. And that happens because we, people who care about conservation, haven't gone ahead of the game to make that land valuable to the people, or even to help them understand what's possible there. And the late we do that, the late the land is being sold. Whoever buys it, being white or Black, but it goes to the rich. And then the second thing you've already said, Holly, let's not underplay or not recognize the value or the role that private landowners also are capable of playing in conservation. We've seen in South Africa where someone would be willing to put a massive land that they would otherwise do anything they would want on it on conservation. Why would they want to do that? But if we care about conservation, we should appreciate that, because if they didn't, then the wildlife that South Africa owns wouldn't be the same. And it's the same in Kenya. So there is both sides, as you said. When it is privately owned, there's more resources to it, mostly rich, so they have money to burn. They will have choppers in there and land cruisers, something that is even harder in community. But it helps conservation, and we should appreciate that.
Thanks, Sam. And we know that there's many challenges. You know, in the Mara area, where I spend a lot of my time working, what have we seen that's come along with privatization and subdivision? Well, fences. It's the first human instinct, right? I get a piece of property. I don't want you on it. I have the right to exclude you, so I'm going to build a fence. Absolutely antithetical to conservation. And as we've seen in the Mara area, it's basically brought an end to our last Kenya-specific migration in the Loita. So there's pluses and minuses, and I think our two speakers today have so helped us to unpack this and to see what are pluses and minuses, what sits behind them, the very deep complexities of the history of land and how it's moved forward, how there have been new opportunities, but there's still many things being held back in many countries. And Sam giving us that hope. Sam, thanks so much, about what things we see that move in a positive direction. I think, Liz, you gave us a lot of hope for that too, by giving us so many ideas of how we can really move that forward. So we're right on our last few minutes, and I want to take this opportunity to thank our two speakers today. We had our doubts about how we were going to be able to pull together the very most incredible sort of information on land rights, on tenure, giving us all more information. And I would just say that we are going to be talking with Liz. She provided us with tremendous additional information that is just hard to put into a session like this. But we're going to be looking for ways to bring Liz's incredible scholarly background as well as her experience by sharing on the website at some point. So we'll keep you notified of that. And I just want to say that I think The team did pretty well at working between the top and the bottom and from the bottom to the top. So for me, I think the last bit also brought in the one little missing piece we had about privatization and about the sort of good and bad things that come with privatization, irrespective of whether it's land owned by white people, owned by Black people. Obviously, you get wealth accumulation, and that wealth accumulation can go in any direction. So it's not really necessarily true that if we turn it over to white owners, it's going to go in a good way, or if we turn it over to Black owners and take it from white owners. So all of this is going to be playing itself out in Africa. And I think we all know that that's one of the things we most love about our continent, is that it is incredibly dynamic and there are things going on all the time. So I keep my spirits up by being very aware of very many places on the continent, and when something goes bad in one place, celebrating the victories of another place. And I'm pretty sure when you get to my stage and Liz's stage, you'll be feeling the same way. And we've got the Sams of the world to keep us going and going and going. And there are many others. And Sam, you're a great inspiration for so many young people who are following you. So unbelievably, we've moved through almost an hour and a half. I think Leanne and I were wondering, are we really going to do this? But we have done it, and we've kept to our times, and we've done a great job. So we want to just hear back from you. I think I've let everybody know what we're going to move on to in our next topic, which is going to be on user rights and what that means and how things go well and don't go well. But we're going to give you actually 3 more questions, and I'll give you a chance. I'll give everybody a chance. We've only got 30-some% who participated, but please, these questions really are used by the team. I mean, Leanne and I look over this. We decide how we want to restructure things to make it better for you, because the audience brings everything to us. So again, thanks to Liz and to Sam, and we'll just finish up with these questions. And we'll look forward to seeing you again on our next one. So please stay and do the questions with us. So the first one is, has your understanding of land tenure in Africa changed after attending today's session? And we seem, Liz, to be having 60% that have learned some new things. And, you know, conservationists don't always admit that there are new things to be learned. So well done, Liz. We're moving along. Okay, there's about 60% who've participated. We're still going up in learning new things. Please, everybody, it really helps us if you can give us your views on these questions. So that's the first one, and we're going to have 2 more polls after this. Okay, on the second one, we're looking at, would you be interested in learning more about land tenure in Africa and how it might positively or negatively impact conservation outcomes? Well, that looks like we've got from 65% of our participants, the answer is 100% yes. So Liz, while you think you beaver away without people being aware and wanting to know more about these things, I think you've convinced our audience here, if they weren't convinced before, that this is really central to so much of what we care about in Africa and so much of our land, and very, very importantly, so many of our people. So I think we've got a good message on that. And lastly, we just wanted to ask people in an open-ended way, what topics would you like to have covered in the future sessions? Because we're always plotting and planning. We're always trying to bring to you new things and, you know, new cuts on old things. So if anyone has anything that they'd like to hear more about, let us know here in your answers. I'm not sure, Leanne, am I able to see those answers?
I don't think so, Holly. They'll go through to, but we'll share them with you.
Now, Sue, on this, we'll be able to see them?
I don't think with an open-ended poll. It'll only be when we download it from Zoom.
Okay, so we're just getting some intel from all of you. So I will take the opportunity to thank all of you. Very interesting. I was watching today. I always watch. We had about 55 participants, and pretty much everybody stayed right up until we got to the bitter end. So thank you so much, and take your opportunity to answer this, and we look forward to seeing you next time. Again, thanks Liz, Sam, and Leanne in the back end. Thanks so much for your support. Goodbye, everyone.